As subscribers to this channel may already know, I have a strange relationship with JRPGs. Let me explain. My favorite franchise, excluding Smash Bros, because I think that's a bit of a cheat code, would easily have to be Pokemon. You may think that that would translate over to some other JRPGs. I'd at least like other ones, right? Nope, it hasn't, not even a little bit. I consider myself to be a fair critic in videos like this, so I acknowledge the weight that Dragon Quest holds in the video game genre and in relation to my favorite franchise. Despite knowing and acknowledging this though, I still have never really spent any time playing games in this franchise. So I decided it may be interesting to take a look at the newly released Dragon Quest XI demo on the Nintendo Switch to see if there's any new developments in the series since its inception over 20 years ago. Who knows, maybe Pokemon could stand to get even more inspiration from Dragon Quest in future games. Let's talk about that. Admittedly, the premise of this video may be pretty crazy to some. After all, these are two franchises that have gained the reputation of being pretty stagnant as time goes on. I think due to the fact that Dragon Quest has an older demographic, it gets away with being more on the classic side than Pokemon does. But if I'm being honest, it's not much different from what I feel is the problem with Pokemon, being that it refuses to stray from those very similar roots despite being more than 2 decades removed from its debut to the world. Before looking into it, I'd agree, but after playing Dragon Quest XI, I'd say there's a decent amount of improvements Pokemon can make that Dragon Quest beat them to, or something that they both do on some level but Dragon Quest does better. Let's talk about presentation. The most obvious thing that separates the two latest entries in these series has to be the visual fidelity and quality of these games. I mean, Dragon Quest XI almost looks like it's the product of a full generational leap over Pokemon Sword and Shield. Obviously, that's because it is. The Switch version of Dragon Quest XI was based on the PlayStation 4 version of the game. That doesn't always have the best results, so it's definitely a notable difference between the two on a visual level. That said, I think it's a bit unfair to take the stance that many have taken with Sword and Shield, stating that if X developers' game can look good on Switch, Game Freak should be able to accomplish the same or better with Sword and Shield. I'm hyper aware of the success of Pokemon as a franchise. I've talked about it at least 100 times on our channels alone, but I'm also hyper aware of the fact that money alone can't buy development experience. The Dragon Quest XI team has a development background that includes several full HD current generation games, whereas this would be Game Freak's first full-scale console game. Before this, they made a whole bunch of mobile games, a remake, and a few 2D games for consoles. They can't be expected to make the shift immediately, but I do think that there is something that Pokemon could learn from Dragon Quest XI in this department too. They don't need to go in alone. The main developer behind Dragon Quest XI, Yuji Horí's game studio Armor Project, received development support from Orca, who is the original team behind Nier, and prior to this, they also helped out with the development of Dragon Quest X. I think Pokemon could manage to have visuals that look just as good if Game Freak enlisted the help of an outside studio to alleviate the workload and make the transition to full-on HD development smoother. After all, the core of the problem isn't skill or acumen like many angry fans seem to believe. It's a numbers game. Development teams for major AAA releases routinely eclipse the entire staff of Game Freak and Pokemon International combined. Even Nintendo EPD staffed up for Breath of the Wild that resulted in the team for the game being comprised of more than 300 people working on it. Also, it didn't hurt that Dragon Quest XI's team didn't have to worry about developing an engine from scratch thanks to their use of Unreal Engine 4. Maybe that could be a transition worth making for the Pokemon dev teams. Even completely removed from all the technical nonsense, Dragon Quest XI does quite a bit to stand out from Pokemon in the presentation department. Something that I immediately realized when playing this game is that the character diversity in terms of their designs is miles ahead of Pokemon in Dragon Quest XI. They've turned trainer classes into a series staple, and that's fine, but I don't think those classes are a good excuse for the straight up palette swap approach they have for the vast majority of NPCs in the Pokemon series. Dragon Quest XI doesn't have a world full of completely different human NPCs, but I think they do a way better job of masking the reused assets than Pokemon does. And that is saying something, because Akira Toriyama, who is responsible for the Dragon Quest character designs and also, if you didn't know, Dragon Ball Z, is notorious for pretty egregious palette swaps. The character in the Dragon Quest Builders 2 box art is literally just Super Saiyan 2 Goku, but in the context of Dragon Quest, it manages to stand out less to me. Also, there's a fair amount of variety in the monsters based on my about 5 hours with the demo so far, and research I've done outside of it. I couldn't find a good source for the exact number of monsters, but I do doubt there's enough to compete with the over 1,000 Pokemon that have been made to date. However, I do think all told, the amount of character designs in Dragon Quest is impressive and could be a source of inspiration for Pokemon. The jury is still out on whether or not this will be introduced in Pokemon Sword and Shield. I do think it's worth noting here that voice acting in a similar vein to how Dragon Quest handles it would work well for Pokemon. Not complete voice acting, but most story beats are accounted for, and that's all that matters. I do think they could start to better determine and define your dynamic between characters. It's not really something Dragon Quest XI does well, since it's also a blank slate protagonist sort of game, but this idea does draw inspiration from another game, Pokemon, but Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. Bring the pre-game surveys to mainline games to inform your character's personality and reactions to story events. Also, the quick little story recaps from your last session that appear when you boot up the game would be a welcome addition too. They wouldn't be new. Pokemon games like Fire Red, Leaf Green, as well as Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum did similar things, and in mentioning that, I think it's even more of a reason for them to continue to implement things like that in the future. Worst case scenario, they can include an option to opt out of those recaps in the settings. The last purely superficial thing I want to mention is just how expressive characters are in this game. Pokemon Sword and Shield seems to be rectifying the completely stoic protagonist problem though. I just thought it was a worthy footnote to include rather than being something urgent Game Freak needs to improve on. And oh yeah, the 2D mode, that's cool. And no, yeah, a photo mode, include that too. As a 90s kid, I'm obligated to talk about photo modes in Pokemon games because Pokemon Snap, and as a YouTuber, I'm obligated to talk about photo modes because it makes thumbnails easier. I'd say the stories of Dragon Quest and Pokemon are trying to accomplish pretty different things, so it's tough to compare them apples to apples. Dragon Quest for the most part is trying to introduce the player to its world and structure, while Pokemon stories tend to be less about an overarching grand adventure within a world that we haven't explored before, and more of a glorified side gig that you take care of while pursuing your real goal of becoming the best trainer in a new region. There aren't as many intertwining motives or twists and turns to your objective. You have one objective that in the grand scheme of things gets derailed for a little bit. I don't think going in the Dragon Quest direction would be a good move though. It felt less deliberate in my opinion. I got tired of another guy or girl showing up and telling me I needed to go to some other place to do a thing I had no context on. Maybe that has to do with my lack of interest in the Dragon Quest universe, but there's one aspect of Dragon Quest storytelling that Pokemon could benefit from: their party system. Pokemon obviously has a party system already. Your Pokemon are your party, but I think it could stand to gain a lot from also introducing an optional human party as well. They flirted with this idea in the past in Gen 4 games. Even to this day, you're joined momentarily by recurring NPCs from time to time. I think expanding on this to focus on different types of trainers in the same way traditional JRPGs include varying classes could be an interesting way to explore and grow as a trainer from other human occupations in the Pokemon world. What if you could be joined by a Nurse Joy in training that teaches you how to craft potions and other healing items from materials you find in the environment? Or what if you meet a Pokemon professor student that could teach you a more efficient way to EV train your Pokemon? Or like, I don't know, a Detective Pikachu that makes it easier to find materials. There's a lot of directions they can go in with this, and it would combine two traditional systems that aren't currently in Pokemon, being the aforementioned party system and a skill tree. It could be limited by only allowing a party member to join you for the amount of time it takes for you to fill out their skill tree, and they could limit you to only one party member at a time. I put this in the story section of the video rather than gameplay because I think it would be a good way to introduce Fire Emblem-like support conversations. Dragon Quest XI also allows you to talk with your party members universe, it's just not as meaningful. For Pokemon, if done more like Fire Emblem, I think it would be a good way to pad out the story while still fitting into the Pokemon universe and how things are done. Speaking of gameplay though, Dragon Quest does two major things that I want Pokemon to adapt and improve upon, with the first of which being the battle system. For the most part, Dragon Quest XI has a battle system I don't think works well with a game like Pokemon, with a lot of the command options not being a good fit for how Pokemon battles work. I do like that Dragon Quest XI introduced movement to the equation, albeit for the sake of cosmetics alone. Movement has no impact on the combat system in that game, but I think Pokemon could change that. I think attack angles factoring in, similar to how Xenoblade games work, could be a natural transition for Pokemon that would add more agency. I also think adding movement to the equation could open the door for strategy centering around the environment, like trying to push a fire type Pokemon into a nearby pond to cause additional damage, or knocking a Pokemon that won't let you flee outside of the battle area for a higher chance of escape. And yeah, I know change is scary and people hate it, so maybe they should also include the option to play the classic battle style like Dragon Quest XI does. We can all have our cake and eat it too. The Dragon Quest XI influence doesn't need to end there either. I think some stuff they do in the overworld could also apply to Pokemon. More specifically, just to name a few things, when traversing the overworld, that actually works quite a bit like the wild area seems to, albeit in a simplified way. Encountering enemies can be more strategic. You can surprise enemies to initiate the battle with an advantage, or you can forgo doing that and approach them while they're sleeping. Hell, if you have a mount and you're a high enough level, you can just bulldoze through them. I think all of those things could apply to a future Pokemon game in the wild area, except for maybe the surprise attack feature, unless they bring back partner Pokemon. Maybe sub that out with Safari Zone elements like throwing bait and rocks to get the upper hand in one way or another. Monsters in Dragon Quest also seem to have different temperaments, with some chasing you, others ignoring you entirely, and some completely avoiding you at all costs. I think for Pokemon games though, it should be tied to a Pokemon's nature rather than species. Lastly, and this is something they do relatively sparingly in Dragon Quest, dogs in the early hours of the game do a couple of things that I think could apply pretty well to Pokemon, and I think this could be a deeper, more interesting mechanic if implemented well, thanks to how Pokemon work. In the beginning of the game, your dog serves as a bit of a guide, racing ahead to the objective to show you where you need to go. This is something partner Pokemon have done once in the past in Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, but this could be something that's central to the partner Pokemon mechanic in the future. The depth that I mentioned could be in how different Pokemon handle this task. Some Pokemon could unwittingly get you lost. Some Pokemon could get distracted with items, some with wild Pokemon or trainers. Others may prefer to follow your lead instead. I realize this and a lot of the other things I mentioned in this video may be a bit too complicated to implement anytime soon, but at least they're cool, and there's always Gen 9. At any rate, which one of these ideas did you like most? Are there any that you think you could expand on and improve? Or maybe some other JRPG mechanics that I didn't think of to add to this video? Let me know that and more in the comments down below. Also, let me know if you would like more Pokemon videos, like a lot more Pokemon videos. They're easy for me to make when there is nothing super newsworthy or a Nintendo Switch game coming out that I'm excited for. And it would be helpful for me to know if you enjoy watching them as much as I enjoy making them. If you enjoyed this video in particular, don't forget to click the like button and share it with a friend who you also think may enjoy it. And to stay up to date on all the new videos every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern time, be sure to ring the bell and subscribe.
Wow, AJ, what are you doing, man? You gotta stop talking about Pokemon over here and you gotta come over to my channel. That's youtube.com/wolfden, where you're gonna talk a lot more about Pokemon in my video.
What? Okay, that's it for me here, I guess, but looks like my services are needed elsewhere, so see you over on Bob's channel. Click the link in the description or in the card.
Isn't Pokemon just a JRPG anyway? That's some weeb shit, man. Come on, let's go. We gotta go. Come on.